They needed this invasion. The Americans needed it. This is what drives U.S. foreign policy to this day. And Russia stands in the way. So it's politics and resources, I think, is what's leading the U.S. to try to overthrow the Russian government and install a Yeltsin-like figure. They get their things whispered in their ear from intelligence sources, and then they launder it, because it's not the CIA saying it, it's the New York Times saying it, and people might believe it. But it's the CIA saying it. Cognitive dissonance, they don't want to hear it, because they're comfortable in the worldview they have right now. And if you start asking all that, you're putting a burden on them of the responsibility to think, to learn some more, to say, wait a minute, maybe they're not telling us all the truth. And who's helping them? Your government and mine.
Exactly.
And it's a disgrace. And they're shutting up their own citizens who are trying to say something about it.
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Hallo bei Gegen den Strom. Wer zur Quelle will, muss gegen den Strom schwimmen. Das weiß Joe Lauria, der große alte Mann, der jung geblieben ist im Herzen der amerikanischen unabhängigen Medien. Vor 30 Jahren hat er Consortium News gegründet. Hallo, Joe Lauria.
Yes.
How was it 30 years ago when you were a founder of Consortium News?
Well, actually, I'm not the founder of Consortium News.
What happened?
A man named Robert Parry is the founder of Consortium News in 1995. We are, yes, marking our 30th anniversary. We believe we're the oldest independent online media in the United States. We went online 5 days before Salon.com, about a month before the New York Times and 2 months before the Los Angeles Times. It was a period in which newspapers were starting an internet edition, middle of the 1990s. And so that was really on the ground floor we got in. Bob Parry is a very interesting character. He is a journalist who worked for the Associated Press, which is the main news agency in the United States. He was working out of the Washington Bureau, and he got a bunch of scoops, the most important of which were related to the Iran-Contra scandal during the Reagan administration. When your watchers might know that the Congress of the United States cut off funding to the Contras in Nicaragua, the Contras being counter-rebellion against the Sandinista overthrow of the Somoza dictatorship, which the United States supported. The Somoza family owning something like 90% of the land in Nicaragua. They were thrown out by the left-wing Sandinistas, and the U.S. was committed to a counter-revolution. So the Contras were being funded by the U.S. Congress, but they killed a few American nuns and priests. They were out of control. They were basically a terrorist organization. They were very much akin to the U.S. supporting Islamist extremists like ISIS or Al-Qaeda in the Middle East. The U.S. has been using these kinds of ugly groups as proxies. This was one of them. So Congress did something good. They cut off the funding. Now, under the U.S. Constitution, only the Congress can allocate money. Well, the U.S. executive branch, the White House, cooked up this scheme where they were going to get the money surreptitiously by selling arms to Iran. And Iran, this was after the revolution, when they were calling U.S. the Great Satan, and this was supposed to be the great enemy of the United States. They took hostages, etc. And here is the Reagan White House using Israel as a middleman, as the middle country, to get the money to give to the countries by selling weapons to the Iranians. Now, the Americans were also, at that time, selling weapons to the Iraqis, which led, in that decade of the 80s, to a horrific war, the Iran-Iraq War, in which maybe or more people died, and they kind of bled each other, very much like what Churchill and even Truman wanted to see the Soviets and the Nazis bleed each other during the war. So the U.S. made money there as well, sort of 50 countries or something selling arms to both sides. While this scheme was going on, in the basement of the White House, there was a colonel called Oliver North, and he was basically running this operation to sell the arms, get the money, send them to the Contras. Well, Bob Parry, in his investigative work at the AP, and a partner of his, uncovered what was going on. And he got the story of Oliver North in the White House basement, and he presented it to his editors, and they were not happy about this.
And it was a very thin line to make the President Reagan responsible for the whole show. And Oliver North, member of the NSA staff, took over responsibility.
Yes, he was the fall guy, you could say, but not at the beginning, so because this was not supposed to be known, and Bob Perry found out about it. So it was a major scoop, but his editors at the Associated Press did not want to run it. They kept saying, well, can you go back and get some more sources and more documents? He said, we have 20 sources telling us that this is what's going on. Can you get Oliver North to confess? This is what they wanted. And while this was going on, the Spanish language service of the Associated Press got hold of the article and translated it and put it out on the Spanish wire. So all of Latin America knew about the Iran-Contra, what was going on, how the U.S. was running this illegal, unconstitutional operation. And the AP had to publish it at that point in English because they couldn't deny it anymore. That's how the story came out, by mistake.
And how did you get into the story of Consortium News?
Yeah, so what happened was Bob got fed up with this. He went to Newsweek. They also were suppressing stories. He started in 1995 an online, he quit the Newsweek because of interference and suppression of articles by his mainstream editors. And he got a various group of other professional journalists who were going through the same process of their editors spiking their stories because they were too critical of the U.S. foreign policy. They were supposed to be there protecting the U.S. foreign policy, but not in a wholesale way, exposing it for things that they were doing, including this illegal activity. So he got a consortium of journalists together to publish the articles they could not get in their publication. And he began that in 1995, hence the name Consortium News.
That was the background of the
That's how
of the name.
Consortium News was founded in 1995. Bob Perry ran this thing. He had some really important stories and writers. They opposed the Iraq invasion. The Veterans Professional Intelligence Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPS, with Ray McGovern and Bill Binney, a former NSA technical director, and Ray McGovern, a former CIA Soviet desk chief. They created this organization, and those memos that they put out were published by Bob and Consortium News, and they opposed the invasion of Iraq before it happened. And then Bob also exposed the Russiagate scandal for the fraud that it was at the time, and he began to write about the coup in Ukraine and war, and he was warning about this leading to nuclear war. Which, when that article came out about Ukraine in 2015, that it could lead to nuclear, I thought he was a little bit exaggerating, but then we saw what happened last year with Biden sending American missiles into Russia and risking a real nuclear confrontation. We're still in that period. This guy, Bob Perry, understood what was happening in Ukraine. He exposed the coup, and he made what was happening in Donbass at that time, where the mainstream media was burying the story. They denied there were neo-Nazis in Ukraine. He published those stories. He got very involved in the MH17 shoot-down, saying that this was not what the official story was saying. So he blazed a lot of trails. He was terrific, and he died, unfortunately, at a pretty young age, 68, and that was in 2018, January. I was named the editor in April of 2018, so I've been running Consortium News for 7 years now, hopefully in the same legacy, the same way that Bob ran his article.
Can you explain why Russiagate was a complete fake news story?
Well, it would take a long time, but I could just tell you that the Hillary Clinton campaign got nervous about Trump, and it was an age-old way of smearing, going back to the Cold War, smearing your opponent as being too close to Moscow. If you can recall the George H.W. Bush election against Bill Clinton in 1990, they claimed that Clinton, as a student, and he did, he went to Moscow. So they tried to make something out of that. It's the age-old, Red Scare smearing of a candidate. And they tried to do that to Trump. But they went too far. They actually tried to say that he was the stooge of Vladimir Putin, and that this was his candidate, and that he was a Manchurian candidate of the Kremlin. And the thing was founded because the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee, which is run by the Clinton campaign, they hired a former MI6 agent to do opposition research, which is, common in every election in the United States. You dig up dirt on your opponents and you embellish that dirt. And then you throw it against the wall and hopefully the media will take it. And this is what both sides do. It's dirty. That's the way politics is fought. Opposition, you do research on your opposition to try to dig up dirt. And this concocted story of Christopher Steele, the MI6 guy who ran a private intelligence agency, was peddled as a real government intelligence agency because he was with MI6, but no longer. He had a private company, and he was hired to write fiction, essentially, which is there's some truth in there, you embellish it. And this was then given to the FBI, and they pressured CIA and others to put it in this January 6, 2017 intelligence assessment, which was a real joke. They blamed RT as being behind this thing because they had a debate with third-party candidates. They showed that that was an interference in the American election. What was the interference in the American? They spent $100,000, the Internet Research Agency, this was Prigozhin's company, in St. Petersburg, to put Facebook ads, half of which came after the election, half of which were for Clinton, half were for Trump. That was supposed to be the influence on the election. Plus this absolute rubbish MI6 crap that was supposed to be. Trump is awful, but he was not a Russian agent. And it's nonsense that anyone believed that. But they were so freaked out by a guy they couldn't control, the intelligence agencies, that they had to stop him or wound him at least. And that's what Russiagate was all about. It was based on nothing but the mainstream media, the Democratic Party mainstream media, just pounded this out like they had a real story. And unfortunately, much of the country still believes it was true.
Why did the mainstream media follow the Democrats' narrative?
Well, because there's only really Fox News that's with the Republicans. And cable news, Fox News destroyed CNN and MSNBC early on because they were still doing kind of journalism, CNN. They actually did real television journalism, which was a thing. And then Fox came with just talking heads and opinion and that, and they won the ratings war. So MSNBC and CNN eventually adopted Murdoch's model and became a talking shop of the Democratic Party's party line. So you had two television networks, CNN and MSNBC for the Democrats, Fox for the Republicans, which were no longer doing any kind of journalism, just churning out the perspective of those two major political parties. And that was the end of television journalism. So the Democratic media believed the Russiagate story and kept churning it out.
In the Ukraine war, Consortium News made public that this war is a big propaganda war. How was it? How was the way in investigating?
Well, Bob, again, the mainstream media denied that there was any involvement of the U.S. government on any level in the overthrow of the Viktor Yanukovych government, which he was democratically elected, certified by the OSCE. If he had another year or so to go in his term, there is an impeachment process. They didn't use that until the day after he left, by the way. There was the Maidan, and there were violent men there, and many of them were extreme right-wingers, right sector, etc. These were neo-Nazi people in a country in the western half of Ukraine that still reveres Stepan Bandera, put statues of him all over the country, and hates Russians. So this was a U.S.-backed overthrow, and we know this mostly, again, from the smoking gun, is the Victoria Nuland telephone call with Jeffrey Piot, which was the American ambassador at the time. Victoria Nuland was the Undersecretary of State for Eurasian Affairs, and she's telling Piot who's going to be in the new Ukrainian government once it's overthrown. Hey, Yanukovych was still there. And they said Yatsenuk would be the prime minister. Guess who became the prime minister? So Yatsenuk. So they funded this.
We don't want Klitsch, fuck the EU. Let's take Yatsenyuk.
Well, that F the EU, I think, was because the Europeans were, they wanted to actually be serious about, for example, maybe at one point, although we learned later, the agreement. What was the name of the agreement?
The Minsk
Minsk, yeah, the Minsk Accords. They were not serious about that, the Europeans, obviously. So he was overthrown violently. He fled the country. Russia did not respond the way Putin later said he should have intervened then. We saw the killing of all those people in that building in Odessa. And then the civil war began when the Americans started and funded, although Obama, to his credit at that time, refused to send lethal aid to Ukraine. And he said it for two reasons. We forget this. He is a New York Times article in which he explains that he said no weapons to Ukraine, although he let Victoria Nuland and others allow this coup to go forward. But when it started getting a little dicey, when the war was beginning against what happened was the Russian speakers in the east, the Donbass region, rejected this coup. They had voted for Yanukovych. They were essentially defending democracy against a coup government that was coming after them because they declared independence from this illegal government. And Russia didn't immediately help them. And certainly they didn't intervene in the way they have now in 2022, even though the Western media kept calling this an invasion. So that was complete rubbish. So Obama said no weapons to them. Two reasons. One, Ukraine is of huge Russian interest, and it's not much of a U.S. interest. He said this. And if we start arming them, it's going to rile up Russia, and it could lead to something like an invasion by Russia of Ukraine. Two, we're afraid American arms will fall into hands of thugs. And hey, you know what he meant by thugs. The neo-Nazis that don't exist. He knows that what kind of extreme right-wing people there were. And he didn't want American arms. And that even the Congress, the House, passed a resolution against funding these groups as well and named them as neo-Nazis. It was not a secret. At the beginning, the BBC and other mainstream media did huge stories right after the Maidan coup that this was fueled by these extreme right-wing neo-Nazi groups using Nazi insignia.
Swastikas and all that.
Okay. So Bob Perry was writing this where the New York Times was denying this, where the Washington Post was denying this. There were these scattered articles in the BBC, but then they buried it. You can't see that anymore. There are no more neo-Nazis. So this is really the contribution that Consortium News made at that time to expose the coup, the American involvement in the coup, and the role of neo-Nazis. And now I will tell you later what happened to us with this organization NewsGuard, but we'll carry on. That's coming a little bit later.
Some weeks ago, Grey Zone published a file of the Institute of Statecraft, based in London, which is linked to the MI6 and NATO. And this institute published in the year 2014 a file that NATO must make Putin invade Ukraine to make him surrender in Ukraine and to destabilize Russia in Ukraine. Does that mean that the whole thing was a farce, a charade, and a geopolitical project like Afghanistan?
There's no question about that. And this, not aware of this document, but that's only more evidence. But the evidence was clear during the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And that was there were movements, the OSCE published documents that more shelling was going on from the Ukrainian side into Donbass. And there was fears of an offensive against Donbass. That's number one. Number two, we saw that Russia said, if you don't negotiate these two treaties, this is December 2021, they offered a treaty to NATO and the United States. It essentially wanted a new security architecture in Europe by removing NATO forward deployments from former Warsaw Pact nations that were now part of NATO and removing the missiles from Romania and Poland that were minutes away from hitting Moscow that Russia argued could be offensive, and the Americans were saying they were defensive against Iran, but nobody believed that story. So the U.S. immediately rejected those two treaty proposals, even though Putin made clear that if you don't at least take this seriously, we could take military technical means. He told them we're going to invade. They needed this invasion. The Americans needed it. And why did they need it? Because they needed the cause to launch their three-pronged attack against Russia, to destabilize, overthrow the Russian government, to return to the 1990s, when the United States essentially ran Russia right after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, with their puppet Yeltsin, who also opposed NATO expansion, by the way, even though he was their man in Washington's man in Moscow. They Wall Street flooded, then carpetbaggers from Wall Street went in there and acid stripped the formerly state-owned industries and impoverished the Russian people and enriched themselves and a new class of oligarchs. So they lost that when Putin came to power. In his famous 2007 Munich Security Conference speech, he really drew the line there. So they thought they could work with him too, but then they found out this guy wanted to restore Russian sovereignty, economic and political sovereignty. And he had his own, he made a deal with the oligarchs. He said, if you stay out of politics, you can do what you want. But if you're involved, I'm going to kick you out of the country, essentially. You're finished. So he took control of the country, and that really ticked off people. So ever since then, they want to get back in there. The resources of Russia, let alone the money they could make in terms of, Goldman Sachs had a big role in that. The voucher system, the one when they privatized the formerly state-owned industries. So they want to get back control of Russia again. I think this is what this project's about. And they only do that, they thought, by an information war, a proxy ground war, and an economic war. The economic war has been lost, and badly. They thought by sanctioning the central bank, first of all, they needed the invasion to do that. You can't just slap these kinds of very severe economic sanctions, including against the central bank of Russia. You can't stop people in orchestras in Munich who are Russian from performing, or ballerinas, or teaching Dostoevsky in an Italian university. These types of measures. You cannot do that. You cannot shut up critics of this policy, anyone who tries to give the Russian point of view. And you couldn't then arm the Ukrainians if Russia didn't invade. So they needed this. And Biden, in a press conference at the time, the day of Russia's intervention, he said, why? This is not about sanctions. We could put more sanctions on. That's not going to change anything. We want people there to suffer because we want them to see what Putin has done. And then when he went to Warsaw, he said, we're going to overthrow Putin. You remember? He slipped up. This was only a few weeks after the invasion. And everybody backed away and said, no, he didn't mean that. Blinken tried to say that we never overthrow governments, which was the comic relief in all of that. And Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, said we're going to weaken Russia. They tipped their hands. There was the RAND study that said this, that this was the way to weaken Russia. You needed Russia to intervene, so they had the excuse to go after Russia. And it's backfired. The economic war, the sanctions have not worked because Russia found a way of trading with a big part of the world, the BRICS nations, China and Russia and India, and together alone, how many people and how big that is. So when I heard that, and even one of the speakers at the conference here said that Putin's diplomatic isolation was ended by Trump in Alaska, I have to laugh. What about the BRICS summit in Kazan?
He never was isolated.
No. The United States is becoming isolated, but they can't see that. This is the problem with the American mindset. They even some of the leaders, I think some of them could see it, but a lot of them are self-deluded into still thinking that they're the good guys who won World War II. And the Russians did something in World War II, but that's not important. They think they're the ones who won World War II. And if you look at every time the U.S. is going to invade and overthrow a government, that leader becomes Hitler. Milosevic was Hitler. Noriega was Hitler. Certainly Saddam was Hitler. The iconography of World War II is what they keep using, because that's when we stormed the beaches. We were the good guys. We saved democracy. It's just not true. It's not true. And what it is, as I said, the U.S. wanting to dominate Russia again because of the resources there, and they also because they're standing in the way. It's not just economics, it's power. Power is something that there's a story of one of the Roman emperors who was in Britain, and he was looking across the sea, and he saw Ireland, and he asked, what is that? And his lieutenant said, they're just some savages there. We don't have to worry about them. No, we better worry about them. You got to take everything. You cannot let anybody stand in your way when you're building an empire. And this is what we have here, a U.S. empire. So the Russians and the Chinese are standing in the way of global domination. It's a delusion to think that any country could rule the world, the whole world right now. But the Americans found themselves at the end of the Second World War with bases all over the world, with devastated economies in Asia and Europe. And the only country that was untouched was the United States. This is where that notion of world dominance began, and I believe the dropping of the 2 bombs in Japan created a megalomania in American leadership that still we live with, that America could dominate the whole world because we used that horrific weapon, and we had all the labor, we had all the resources at our beck. All over the world, we can overthrow governments so that in that area where there's tin and that area where there's rubber, like Southeast Asia, we will put our governments in there and we'll be able to get the incredible amount of wealth. And this is what drives U.S. foreign policy to this day. And Russia stands in the way. So it's politics and resources, I think, is what's leading the U.S. to try to overthrow the Russian government and install a Yeltsin-like figure. It has not worked. And the only way Ukraine could win this war is if NATO directly gets involved, which could lead to a nuclear catastrophe. And that's why it looks like NATO is not going to do it. So they have to give up Ukrainians because they cannot win unless we risk this third world war.
Do you see in Western elites a kind of apocalyptic blindness?
I see blindness.
Not only apocalyptic.
Well, I have to think that they're not that mad. That they might be a few here or there, but I think that they realize that they cannot directly attack Russia. But they were pushing the envelope. They keep pushing it. When Biden allowed those missiles, American missiles, I've forgotten already what they were called, into Russia, and when Russia made it clear that this is not an attack of Ukraine against us, because these are American weapons operated by American soldiers, it's just from a third country, Ukraine. This is an attack of the United States against Russian territory from a third proxy world country. You cannot make that risk, but Biden did. He sent those missiles in there. The Germans said they would send their Taurus missiles in as well, didn't they? And this is really going right to the edge. Because they think Putin is bluffing. They cannot think that the Russians are bluffing about this thing. And I think that Putin made it clear from the very beginning, from the night of his announcement in February 2022, that we have nuclear weapons. I don't think that was a threat. I think that was a warning. In case you think you might be able to fight us, don't worry, we have those weapons. So think again. And so far, that's worked. I think that's why we haven't seen a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, and I hope that we do not. And I don't think the leaders are that insane or, as you say, blind, apocalyptically blind, to not know what the consequences are. If they are, we really need to start saying our prayers. But I think that despite the poor leadership in Europe, from Starmer to Macron to von der Leyen to all of the Schultz before Merz, I don't think that they're going to risk everybody's lives.
But they're talking about very loudly.
They talk about it. They talk about Russia being a threat to Western. Joe Biden, one time he was ridiculing the Russians for taking so long to just take Kharkiv province. You cannot take that oblast. They're weak. The Russians say it's a joke. Von der Leyen said they're using washing machine parts in their weapons. Their economy is in tatters. And then the next breath, they're going to be in Paris by Christmas. So how could this weak, disastrous Russian military that doesn't know which way to shoot is now a threat to Western Europe? They're going to invade. They're going to invade the Baltics. They're going to invade Poland. Then their next is Germany. And after that, France, just like Hitler did. And they say that because they need to provoke Russia again. Because they're losing this part of the war. They provoked them the first time to invade Ukraine, thinking that the economic sanctions would bring Russia to its knees and get rid of Putin, and that the U.S. and the West would march in again. Didn't work. They thought that they would fool the whole world into explaining that that was an unprovoked invasion, that Vladimir Putin woke up one morning and he spun the globe and he put his finger and it landed on Ukraine. I'm going to invade Ukraine. No reason. Nothing happened before. It's just because he wanted to invade, because he's an evil dictator. This is where you open a novel and you see somebody get shot and you think, oh, that guy's guilty. You don't know why this happened. There was no context. and we're going to talk about what Consortium News does and what alternative media should do, or independent media,
And
is to
that's
provide
context.
the context that the mainstream media purposely leaves out, so that you get not a direct lie, but through omission, you get a completely false concept that the Palestinians are doing this only because they hate Jews, they're anti-Semites. There's no other thing that ever happened. Israel never did anything to those people, because you don't hear about what happened in 1948, how the state of Israel was founded, how 700,000 people were ethnically cleansed from the country. That context is gone. And you don't hear about all the things that led the 2014 coup, which they deny, the neo-Nazis, which they deny, the expansion of NATO, which they don't think is important. All of the facts that led to Russia repeatedly telling the West stop, from the Munich 2007 conference to a 2009 treaty that Russia put forward to create a new security architecture in Europe, from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Remember that Europe was supposed to be after the Cold War, but the U.S.
Carter of
did
Paris.
not use the power that they had to try to bring stability to the world, some equality and peace. They won the Cold War and they wanted their spoils. That's the problem here. And they still want the spoils.
Would you say mainstream media are lying by leaving out?
It's a way of lying, except some of those reporters are so dumb, they don't even know what they're leaving out. So you could hardly blame them for lying. They think that's what the story is, some of them. Others know better. And the editors should know better, but, they grow up in this system. They read that media growing up. They're repeating the stories, the fables that they learned, not knowing their fables. So I would never say directly someone's lying unless I could prove they knew what they say was not true. It's sort of like libel law. You can't say I've libeled you unless I knew that what I said about you was. You got to prove that I knew it was false, and I said it anyway to hurt you. That's the kind of standard I would use in libel law. I would use to say whether journalists are lying or not. They are peddling a set of assumptions that America is a fundamentally good nation trying to spread democracy around the world. And that's all they're doing. They're trying to help people. It's not about any of their economic or geostrategic interests. They're not like other empires. They're not an empire. They're not an empire. There was a guy called... I'm forgetting his name, but he ran for president in 2008, and he was interviewed on a New York radio station, and this guy asked an incredible question. I was listening to it. He said, is America an empire? And there was silence for about 8 seconds, which is not good on radio. And suddenly he said, gee, I hope not. Gee, I hope not. So this concept of the U.S. not being an empire is ingrained in American thinking. We're not an empire. We just happen to have bases all over the world. We're poking our nose everywhere. We overthrow governments left, right, and center since 1947. I mean, dozens of governments have been overthrown. But we're not doing it for any other reason than that we want to help people. And the proof that that's a lie is they've overthrown democratically elected leaders. They're not just trying to overthrow a dictator like Saddam Hussein. They overthrew Salvador Allende. They overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala. They overthrew Yanukovych in Ukraine. It's part of their playbook. They'd like to talk about the Russian playbook. The Americans have a very thick playbook, and they use it repeatedly, but the mainstream media runs cover for them, pretends. They get their news they get their things whispered in their ear from intelligence sources, and then they launder it, because it's not the CIA saying it, it's the New York Times saying it, and people might believe it. But it's the CIA saying it. And then they deny it. They will deny or confirm. Was it Kissinger or somebody admitted once where what we do is we tell the press something which is in our interest, it may not be true. They publish it, and then people come to the government and say, is it true? And we confirm it without knowing who the source was. So it's a terrible game. But the U.S. certainly is, I think that the Soviet Union made empire a dirty word because before that, British were proud of their empire. Spanish were proud of their empire. Americans had an empire in the late 19th century when they took the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. They were defeating the decrepit, ending Spanish Empire, which rose up in the 16th century, whatnot, and fought. And the British tried then to fight them. Even Cromwell fighting against the Spanish Empire in North America. And that was over, and the American Empire was supplanting the Spanish Empire. But there was an anti-imperialist league. Mark Twain was part of that. So the idea that America was an empire in the late 19th century when McKinley was president was not a bad thing. But the Soviets imperialist. You're an imperialist running dog. So they made it a dirty word. So now, as Ronald Reagan said, the imperialists for the Soviets, the evil empire, he called it. So we're not an empire. Even if we walk like one and we talk like one and we look like one, we're not an empire. We're just helping people.
According to the New York Times, the war in Ukraine, the actions at the front line are orchestrated, organized, and planned by American soldiers in the German city Wiesbaden.
Yep.
So Germany and America are part of the war.
Essential part of the war. It's their war. They're just using Ukraine. They don't give a damn about Ukrainian men dying. They're using Ukraine as a way to get at Russia. And that's what it was from the very beginning when Biden admitted that we're trying to overthrow Putin just weeks after the invasion. They needed to get Russia to invade or they couldn't unleash the information, the economic, and the proxy war on the ground. They're losing all of them. The only people who believe the story about the unprovoked invasion, living in Europe and the United States. Most of the people around the rest of the world saw what happened. They could see what happened. The economic sanctions did not work because Russia has worked out a whole new economic trading system, a financial system with so many of these other countries. And that is cutting out the U.S. to the point where they may cut out the U.S. dollar more and more, which is freaking out Donald Trump, I think in January when he was first inaugurated, didn't know what BRICS was. Now, he's found out what BRICS is. Somebody explained that this is a real threat to the United States. This is really what the major conflict in the world today is between these two. What will we survive? Cooperation of nations together in a multipolar world of different, not one power, but many working together? Or the dominance of one power and a few European vassal states, if I might say, against this? Which side's going to win?
The United States and their European vassals, an empire in decline.
Not fast enough, in my opinion. But there are signs of it, absolutely. And particularly if they lose the dollar as the major trading currency. If the BRICS do replace it. That hasn't happened really yet. There's always been talk to dollar. But they still have... Saudis is one sign, I should say, of a decline in American power is that Saudi Arabia has opened up to China, and the Chinese orchestrated a rapprochement with Iran, which was extraordinary because almost every conflict in the Middle East was at its heart proxies of either Saudi Arabia, the Sunnis, or the Shia, the Iranians. And in Lebanon, in Bahrain, in Yemen, all these conflicts were back to that, and the Chinese tried to bring them together. So the U.S. losing that influence over Saudi Arabia is extraordinary. But they still are running a genocide right now with the help of their proxies. So they are not finished. And these are overlapping empires, in my view. The Israelis have a regional empire, which they're trying to recreate from biblical days. And all the language that they use is not just flowery language. They literally take those old Bible empires, literally, they take it and they want to restore King David or even larger empire now. And the United States has an overarching empire globally, so locally they need Israel to do some work for them there, and they want their proxies to be in charge. They want to run the whole world, like I said, but it is certainly in decline, but I don't think they really know that yet. I think certain people do. But this thing could go on for decades more. When is an empire really over? How long did it take for this Roman Empire to finally collapse?
A century.
It ended, but the Eastern Empire continued, right,
Mm-hmm.
for a long time. And then there was a Holy Roman Empire. And so the American influence in the world will not go away in our lifetime and their dominance, but they need to get a bloody nose once in a while. And they have been, by the way. What war did they win? They lost Vietnam, a nation in some areas where they were using spears. I went to a museum somewhere in Vietnam, and they showed the weapons that were being used against the Americans. And it was in that area that there was actual serious talk by Nixon of using a nuclear weapon against them. So men with spears, of course they had more than spears, but a nation so nowhere near as powerful beat the United States. They lost the war in Iraq, essentially. They lost the war, and they overthrew Saddam, but they lost the peace there. And Iran has got so much influence in Iraq. And then the ISIS, which they then helped to develop to fight, not in Iraq, but in Syria, to try to overthrow, which they won that, by the way, eventually in Syria. Did get an al-Qaeda guy to run the country, which is just awful and a terrible thing. So I'm not going to say that the American empire is like on the way out tomorrow, but there are definitely signs of decline, but things could happen that could change this. But right now, I think they got a few victories, like the Syria one, and they're able to finance and run conjointly with Israel a genocide. They're getting away with it. If you're an empire in decline, I don't think you would get away with that. Although the public is turning against Israel very strongly and against U.S. support. And in Germany, who said they will no longer support Israel with arms, and they were the second largest supplier of arms after the U.S. That was an extraordinary thing that they did. And I think, and we discussed it before we began taping, I think it's the public pressure has something to do with that, right? That why Germany decided not to arm Israel anymore. So that pressure's getting to the U.S. legislators, but not Trump. So not Trump.
How do you evaluate the summit in Anchorage, Alaska, of Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump?
I think this was an opportunity to flatter Trump, to get him on Russia's side, to try to once more explain to him what this war is about, that it's not just a land grab by Russia against Ukraine, that it's about creating this new security architecture in Europe. I think ultimately we're going to have to come back to those treaties that were rejected by the Biden administration and by NATO. That's where we have to go. It's going to have to go back to that, and we're going to have to go back to another Istanbul process, Istanbul 2, maybe 3 or 4, where if the Ukrainians had taken that deal, and they did essentially, was the United States with Boris Johnson telling Ukraine not to take it. Because that would have ended the war right there. Russia was willing to end that war if they got the neutrality that they sought. They wanted those 2 treaties, and they certainly wanted some autonomy, at least for Donbass, which is what the Minsk Accords were supposed to have brought about, and which were, as we found from Angela Merkel, who they never took seriously. And Francois Hollande admitted that they just strung the Russians along while we armed Ukraine. Now, the public think we armed Ukraine to defend against Russian aggression. Well, they were arming Ukraine to put pressure on Russia, to get them to invade, to launch the 3 wars that they're losing. And I think they need to talk every day about how Russia is a threat to Europe, and we're going to have a war with Russia. They can attack Western Europe. Like I said, they can't take a little town in Ukraine. Bakhmut took them like 6 months to take that, but they're going to be running over Berlin any day now. So they need that in order to get Russia to do something stupid, like invade a Baltic country. But the formula didn't work in Ukraine. Why do they think it's going to work in the Baltics? Well, I don't understand why they keep pressuring this lie. And I think this they do know is a lie. I think Macron knows it's a lie.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
That Russia has no interest or capability of invading Western Europe. I don't think the Soviets ever wanted to invade Western Europe. That was also drummed up, missile gap, all that during the Cold War. They totally exaggerated Russian military strength in order to get the arms purchases they needed in the Congress in the U.S., and they wanted to keep the continent and the Americans total fear of the Russians all the time. So I'm afraid that they're trying to provoke Russia to do another. Now, the argument was, I was on the Russian Rossiya 1, their main Russian TV station, just before February 20, and they asked me what I thought was happening, and I said, I think they're laying a trap for, and I wrote an article in Consortium News, before the intervention of Russia. They're setting a trap. They want Russia to invade. Then they could do what I'm saying. And then they asked me, well, what is your advice for the Russian government? I said, I'm an American. I am not going to give an advice to the Russian government about whether they should intervene. Although I think now in retrospect, maybe they could have tried just missiles from Russia if the Ukrainians attacked Donbass, as it looked like they were about to. Maybe they could have fired more. And they did have proxies there, like the Wagner Group did go in 2014. But it wasn't a full-scale invasion like they portrayed it. So there may have been ways to try to defend Donbass without the full-scale invasion. But by that point, when they knew that Minsk was over, And Putin said he should have intervened 8 years ago after the coup. That may have been a quicker end to this.
Trying to explain these deep insights to German public, I learned that more than 2/3 of the population in Germany want to follow the official narrative. They don't listen. They refuse to hear to my arguments. Can you explain why that happens?
You're putting me on the spot. I think Erich Fromm wrote a book in the 1950s called Fear of Freedom. And he tried to explain why the German people went along with the Nazis. And it wasn't just about the Germans. We're talking again about the Germans. But most people do not want to think for themselves. It's too difficult. It's much easier if people show the way for them. They have very, very local domestic concerns. Their family, their friends, their job, getting a better job, etc., security, all these things. And they don't really want to get involved in all of this. So they leave it to what they think are the leaders they voted for. Even if the ones they didn't vote for, they're the leaders of the country. I find it hard to put myself in the shoes of that type of person, which makes up the majority of Western countries, or maybe any country. But why don't they want to know more information, at least, than what's being told to them? This narrative that is so superficial and leaves so much out. And once you try to tell them this is an interesting point you're making, they don't want to hear it. There's cognitive dissonance. They don't want to hear it because they're comfortable in the worldview they have right now. And if you start asking all that, you're putting a burden on them of the responsibility to think, to learn some more, to say, wait a minute, maybe they're not telling us all the truth. So, and I don't want to feel like a traitor to my country. There's this sense of loyalty still. It's drummed into every school child. The flag, whatever flag it is, the history of the country, the founding fathers of America. I mean, all this garbage. We'd say in America, and this is from Aristotle, that a nation of laws, not men. That's what should be striven for. And Americans think they are a nation of laws, not men. Then how come in Washington, D.C., when I'm on the highway, I see the Washington Monument and Obelisk, I see the Jefferson Memorial, I see all these, Lincoln Memorial, they're monuments to men. These are the myth makers of our country in the United States. Washington. This whole thing, people don't have time. They're busy, they're working 2 jobs, especially in the U.S. where you don't get health insurance. So, you just put the TV on and shut your mind off. You don't want to deal with this. So there's a lot of advantages to devious, deceptive leaders in a population that is either too afraid to think for themselves or don't have the time to think for themselves and just want to stay the way things are and don't want to be disturbed.
Given this mentality, I think the power of independent media is very limited.
I totally agree with you.
And which possibilities remain on the side of the independent media? What can we do?
This is the big question. We want to expand our audience. Basically, we have a Consortium News, since the days of Bob Perry, has had an audience, according to Google Analytics, of 55 or older. Almost 80% of our readers are older adults. Many over 60, over 70. We're going to lose those readers eventually. We can't get young people to be interested in this message. I think maybe the gray zone, because there are younger people running it, but I don't know what their analytics say about their who reads the age.
Are the younger people
demographics
involved in a kind? Are they in prison in a prison of conformity?
Well, I think if you look at what's going on about Gaza, we're seeing that things are still can get so bad that it drives young people to the streets, and then look at the repression, and it's happening in Germany, obviously, maybe worse in the U.S. The repression against anti-genocide protesters, the smearing of them, the lawfare being used against them. In Britain, Palestine Action being called a terrorist organization by the Home Secretary. This is just a group that went into an RAF base and put red paint on a plane that's taking part in the attacks on Gaza by providing intelligence, whatever. So yes, they've damaged some property. That's not terrorism. Under the Terrorism Act of 2000, they have been prescribed. They are like Hamas now. So if you utter words in support of Palestine action, let alone Hamas, you can go to jail for 14 years. And there are people, there's a British journalist who lives in Vienna, and I'm going to visit him, who is facing 14 years in jail because of the things he says about Israel, his reporting. And because you criticize Israel, they're using this unbelievably but age-old tactic of saying you must then be for Hamas if you criticize Israel. So he's supporting Hamas, he's supporting terrorism.
In total, that means the audience of independent media are a small minority, and at the same time, the states, the Western states, are destroying their democracy by repression.
Absolutely. And social democracy is something we have to talk about because that has changed so much. Whereas before, the only way you really got information was from the big media and some small independent outlets. With the advent of the internet, which has allowed so many more. Consortium News was one of the first, if not the first, we think, in the United States online. There were other left-wing magazines, The Masses, which also the Justice Department imprisoned or prosecuted under the Espionage Act, editors from a left-wing publication called The Masses right around the time of the First World War. So, and the Sedition Act that came out under Wilson. So this is not something new. And then, of course, McCarthy era. So we've had these waves of incredible repression against thought, against speech, against journalism, not any kind of physical violence or any kind of threat to anybody's personal or property. Well, the RAF, okay. But it's about the news that you're putting out that will break their cover and destroy what we were saying. Those people who will go along with what the government is saying, funneled through mainstream media, owned by major businessmen, major corporations that are in league with the government, that own, in many ways, run the governments. The corporations do. So that's what the mainstream media is, to protect and preserve and further the powerful interests of these corporate and government entities. So you've got somebody like Consortium News saying, well, wait a minute, this is not what happened in Ukraine. And here's all the facts. They have to smear us, and we were smeared all the time. We've had many people attacking us. We had PayPal cut us off. We can't use them anymore. And the only thing in their user agreement is that you can't spread misinformation. So they think we're spreading misinformation. They refuse to say that on the record. We had an organization called NewsGuard say that we argued libel, that they libeled us because they said that we were publishing repeatedly false information about Ukraine. And I wrote two huge articles, as detailed as I could, to prove there was a coup and the Americans were involved, and that there are right-wing extremist neo-Nazi type groups getting inspiration from Bandera, and they took part in the coup, and they're fighting in Donbass, and they did in Mariupol, etc. And they said that was all a lie. They said that was a lie. And we went and sued them, but unfortunately, the legal system in the United States, like in many countries, is on the side of the establishment. And they are not also run by the law so much. Judges are susceptible to political bias, even unconscious bias. So a judge in the Southern District of New York, which is a very democratic part of the United States, threw our case out. They threw the case out, even though I think without even allowing a hearing, almost after a year and a half. And we argued that when Trump came to power the second time, he had an executive order ordering American government officials could not take part with private companies to suppress Americans' free speech. And what this company, NewsGuard, did is they had a contract with the Pentagon for $750,000, and they were there they say, I don't know what they say it was, but if you read what they were doing, it was going after Ukraine and news reporting, basically.
Is this organized by a kind of censorship complex, censorship industry?
No, I don't think there's a complex like that. I don't think they're in a war room somewhere giving out orders. You do this, and it's their own. They all have these big corporate entities and government. They have their interests, and so they're working independently and at the same time together to suppress anything, information that undermines what they need people to think, which is not think, which we just discussed. Don't make people think. If you start making people think, and you're giving alternative information, and you giving the context, the historical context of what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Ukraine. They can't abide by that. They can't allow that. So they are, in this instance, we believe the government was working with this private company to violate our First Amendment rights. We also sued the government because it's clear Supreme Court rulings in the U.S. has determined that what the U.S. government cannot do on their own, they can't hire a private company to do. So they couldn't directly shut us down, or then you have to shut down, by the way, just abridge the free speech. That's what the Constitution says. Curb your free speech by telling people don't read this organization, give them a bad grade, and make this available in university libraries so students won't read Consortium News because this organization, which was working with the Pentagon, says that we were lying repeatedly about what happened in Ukraine. Okay? So this, in that case, we believe it was organized, but the judge threw it out. So legally, we didn't win. Yeah.
But that means the democratic information space is collapsing and the facade of democracy is collapsing as well. Do the elites, the Western elites, start to run their countries by open repression?
Happened before, didn't it? It's happened before in your country pretty badly in the 1930s. And there was democracy before that, wasn't there? Right after the First World War. It happened in the U.S. with McCarthyism. It happened earlier around Woodrow Wilson, the time of his Alien Sedition Act and the Espionage Act, which we then saw was used against Julian Assange in our time. That's the most important case about going after a publisher. He did nothing other than publish information, which turned out to be true about those emails from the Democratic National Committee. They were never proven false or frauds or anything. So what that Russia may have given, there's no proof that Russia gave it to them, but let's say they did, it doesn't matter. Because when you are a journalist and somebody gives you a document, it doesn't matter who it is. If you could prove the document's true and it's newsworthy, you use it. And the proof of that is WikiLeaks pioneered an anonymous Dropbox that now the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Guardian, BBC, they're all using this, probably in Germany too, Frankfurt Allgemeine and the Rundschau, and they probably all have anonymous Dropboxes so that if you have some document that's, and you're a whistleblower, you just send it to them anonymously. They don't know who the source is, but you get the document. If it's true, it's news. So CNN may have run stories that Russia could have been their source. They don't even know it. So it doesn't matter on a document. When you're interviewing someone orally, you don't have a documentary proof, then you have to be very careful and vet them because you don't know what their motives are. But if they give you a document, it could have been Russia, it doesn't matter. Russia put, if it was Russia, and I don't believe there's proof there was, they put information into the American election in 2016, not disinformation. That's the misconception. Nobody actually says that directly because they know that what those emails showed about Hillary Clinton and the DNC were true. The 5 top DNC officials quit when WikiLeaks released this during the convention. Debbie Wasserman Schultz was the head of the committee. She resigned because it was true. So if it was Russia, they put true, they did journalism. They gave information to WikiLeaks, which helped the American public and voter understand who this candidate was. So they went after Julian Assange, and fortunately, they cut a deal. That was so repressive. So you're asking me, are they going to be repressing the public in journalism? Yes. Yes. Richard Medhurst, living over here in Vienna, is a British journalist, and they arrested him and held him for 24 hours at Heathrow Airport, and he's now being threatened all the time with prosecution. Austrian police raided his home a couple of months ago, at the behest, it seems, of the British government. And he's showing some evidence where the Israelis have worked with the British government to go after this huge critic who has a big online following of Israel. Just like there's evidence now that Israel worked with the Home Office to go after this group, Palestine Action. So the Israeli government, it looks like, is working directly with police enforcement. The head of a unit in the New York Police Department who went after the Columbia students who were demonstrating is a former IDF officer. You mean, this is really scary stuff. The country committing the genocide seems to have an involvement not only in getting those countries like Germany and Britain and the United States to support this with money and arms. Germany no more long arms, but they're also being able to use those governments that are their allies to repress their own citizens, it seems like. Just repress them, criticizing and calling it a genocide. We will commit genocide, and you've got to shut your citizens up who are seeing that it's a genocide and trying to protest against it. You have to keep the lie going until we can cleanse the whole place. This is Ben-Gurion's dream come true. You read his diary. He had all of historic Palestine was going to become part of Israel. And it was an ethnic cleansing, and it said it. They organized it in a place called the Red House near Tel Aviv. All the plans were hatched. You could read the wonderful historian Ilan Pappé. He's laid it all out in his book, Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. There were hundreds of villages that were destroyed. Thousands of Palestinians were killed, not just Deir Yassim, one little thing that becomes the one that the Israelis admit. They were terrorists, of course. They blew up the King David Hotel, and they kicked out the Palestinians from Palestine, and they didn't finish the job yet to get all of Palestine. This is their opportunity with these extreme right-wing members of Netanyahu's government that used to be in mainstream Israel nut jobs. These guys were the followers of Maya Kahane, which is with a New York rabbi who was an extremist who wanted to ethnically cleanse the rest of Palestine. They were kept out of government. They were always seen as the crazies. They're in government now, and this is their opportunity. They're not going to stop now because they saw that 67, 73, these wars, they got more territory. They got part of Syria. They got the Sinai and gave it back. This is their chance, and they're not going to blow it. And who's helping them? Your government and mine.
Exactly.
And it's a disgrace. And they're shutting up their own citizens who are trying to say something about it, including our newspaper. People want to shut us up too.
One more example for the huge amount of repression in Western democracies. So, which chances have independent media in future? What do you recommend?
Look, I worked in the mainstream media for many, many years. I worked for the Wall Street Journal for 6 years, for the Boston Globe, for the Sunday Times of London for 10 years as an investigative reporter for them. I worked for Bloomberg News, for the Sunday Business in London, the Johannesburg Star, the Montreal Gazette, the German Presse, the Deutsche Presseagentur, their English service. I learned the skills of journalism there. I have to admit that. The politics is what's wrong. A lot of people in independent media don't have that training. They don't understand evaluating evidence, trying to get a response from the other side in the story, how to structure a news article. So we need to see training with independent media so that we could use the same tools that the mainstream media are misusing, and to use them correctly to tell the parts of the story that are being purposely left out and repressed, because that changes the entire narrative of Ukraine and Palestine if you know the historical context. And that's what they're purposely leaving out. And that's what we purposely published, and that's what that organization, NewsGuard, purposely, we believe, working with the Pentagon, went after us to try to get people to say that those are all lies. What's being left out? So if you're going to speak up, they're going to come after you. It's disgraceful. It's beyond disgraceful to call ourselves a democracy anymore.
Independent media must get better, must professionalize.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Joe Lauria. Die unabhängigen Medien müssen sich professionalisieren, sie müssen besser werden. Das sagt Joe Lauria, der Doyen der unabhängigen Presse in den Vereinigten Staaten. Wir bei Gegen den Strom bringen Informationen, die Sie in den Mainstream-Medien nicht bekommen. Teilen Sie unsere Informationen und abonnieren Sie unseren Kanal.